Welcome to Bold Voices, Good Yarns. I'm your host, Ian Henzel. Behind every book lies an author's life story. So join me on an interactive journey as we step between the pages to explore how an author's life and their experiences have shaped the stories that we cherish and love. So sit back, relax, grab a cup of joe or a cocktail, and join me as we step between the pages. I'm Ian Henzel, your host here on Bold Voices, Good Yarns, and our guest today is Elisabeth Nonas, who is the author of Grace Period, published by Rattling Good Yarns Press. Welcome, Elisabeth.
Hi, Ian. It's great to be here.
We're glad to have you on the show. So we're going to kind of jump between the pages, not only of your book, but of your life.
Right.
So let's explore what makes Elisabeth tick. Thinking about your early childhood, what shaped your worldview in your childhood or young adulthood?
Well, you asked, that's a big question. I grew up in New York City, and I think the city shaped my worldview a lot. Father was a doctor, and his attitude toward his work shaped my worldview a lot, although I wasn't aware of that until many, many years later. I don't know. Let's talk more and see what else comes out.
Well, as a doctor, I think earlier you were saying that sometimes you would be sitting in his waiting room as a child and there would be nothing to do. I mean, did you read? Was that like?
My father was a doctor. He was an internist. So his office was in the building that we lived in, on the ground floor of the building that we lived in, but the hospital that he put his patients into was not in our building. And he was the kind of doctor that made house calls and would talk to his patients on the phone after dinner and would do rounds at the hospital many days of the week and always on the weekend. And sometimes I would go with him while he made rounds. I didn't go on the rounds with him, but I got to sit in a very dim, depressing waiting room on whatever floor his patients were on. And I probably usually brought a book, and there was probably Highlights for Children, which was a magazine that I think he got.
I remember.
That. He was not a pediatrician. He didn't have kids. He didn't treat children, but I had that magazine. And so I would read.
So it was a reading and creative time. Highlights. God, I hated highlights. So I know we were talking earlier before we came on the air that when you went to school, you studied film.
I did eventually. I went to graduate school for film. I was an English major in college. And before that, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I grew up, I had friends who wanted to be a doctor or a lawyer or something, whatever. I never had any idea. And in 8th grade, we took an aptitude test that was multiple choice. And there were 3, at the end, you had a question, what do you want to be when you grow up? And there were 3 lines to write in. And I had nothing, but I thought I can't do that. So I wrote comedian, which my parents didn't find funny. So I guess I crossed that out pretty quickly. And I was an English major in college. I wrote poetry. I was in a
No. Why do you think you wrote comedian as a child?
No idea, but
okay.
It seemed funny. I don't know. I guess I'll have to go back to therapy to figure that one out. It was the only thing that came into my mind.
But at least you didn't write down world dictator. So
right.
you had said that you were writing poetry.
Yes. And luckily I didn't continue on that track. And I kind of still didn't know what I wanted to do. I mean, when I was writing poetry, I envisioned, lining a small or large room with rejection letters, when I submitted my poems places. But after graduation, I didn't write a poem for like months and months and months. So I thought, well, maybe that's not the thing. And by then I'd gotten interested in photography, still photography. So I was living in Manhattan and thought, I'm going to go to graduate school because I never really studied photography. And I knew that I wanted to learn everything about it technically that I could. So I was going to apply to Rochester Institute of Technology, and I had a portfolio all set to send out. And I ran into a friend who I'd grown up with, who I hadn't seen for years. And she said, Rochester, well, there are 2 really good film schools in Manhattan. You should go there. And I didn't bother to correct her and say, no, I'm going for still photography. I just never applied to RIT. I applied to the 2 film schools in Manhattan, and I went to NYU. And when I got there, I thought, oh, this makes so much sense because nothing affects me the way a movie does. So there I was in film school, and was sort of the same reason I went to film school. I had never studied it as an undergraduate, and I wanted to learn everything I could about it, the technical aspects. I wanted to direct, but I wanted to have the vocabulary to be able to talk to all the different people who would be working on the set with me.
Now, did you ever write a screenplay, and how
I've
far did you
written
get?
a number that far. I wrote a number of screenplays. I made a few films at NYU. My last film was a finalist for the Student Academy Award, and it won some other awards, and it got me my first agent. And I thought, I have to go to LA. I should say this is somebody, I never thought I was going to leave Manhattan. That certainly shaped my worldview. It's like, there's only Manhattan. But I thought the industry is in LA and I have to go to LA. So I moved to LA, and this was in the late 70s. And I had my award-winning student film, and I had an agent, and people said, this is great. Your film is great. I mean, technically you can direct. You're a woman. Nobody's going to give you any money. Have you ever thought about writing? And that's when I started writing screenplays. And I'm going to cut those years into like 2 sentences. I didn't get very far, and that was very frustrating to me. And the 2 scripts that got the most response and got the closest to being made were both very personal to me. And once I had finished those, it was very hard to go back to trying to come up to something that would appeal to a general audience. So I had been keeping a notebook with stories about women, and I basically, not connected stories, not even complete stories, just little scenes. And I basically turned those into my first novel.
And for our listeners, viewers, Grace Period is about an older woman who is a film professor, correct?
Correct.
And she teaches film. And there's also an aspect of video games. And we were talking off camera. And you also wrote for video games.
No, I didn't. I taught writing for video games, which is even stranger. Hannah, the character in Grace Period, teaches screenwriting. And Hannah teaches screenwriting, and I had taught screenwriting and writing for video games and emerging media, because the world of narrative delivery changed very dramatically from when I first started teaching, when I was still in Los Angeles. Then I was teaching prose, but in the late 80s. And by the time I got to Ithaca in 1995, there was still mainly film and television, but video game was it's a bigger industry than film and television. So
I did not know that. I did not know that. And it's interesting because not being remotely related to the film industry or television, I've never really thought about how video games and their narrative. I'm the oldest video gamer in the world, but I've never really thought about there is obviously there's a story, but somebody has to write it. Interesting how pieces of your life, because in Grace Period, a retired film professor who loses her younger wife suddenly and has to deal with grief and readjusting to being on her own and finding out things about her wife. There's a scene that takes place in LA and Palm Springs. And so it seems like you've pulled pieces of your life into Grace Period. They've kind of made their way in. So I'd like to do a pivot now, if I could, because it's something we ask every one of our guests. So if you could live in a book and move into a book, and your favorite book might be The Pit and the Pendulum, but who wants to live there? What book do you think you'd want to move into and live in? That's
a really interesting question. Sometimes I read to get out of my life, to be somewhere else. If I know I'm going to go to a city, I want to read a book that's set in that city. And I love reading mysteries, but I don't want to live in any of those. And not just because it's a mystery. I don't want to be around danger. I think I want to live in the books that I'm writing. That I'm writing the world that I would like to live in, which is very similar to the world that I do live in, but I don't want to say one bubble past plum. It's maybe next to or adjacent to or an ideal version of.
Do you think it's slightly idolized?
Maybe a better version I think basically I'm an optimistic writer. I mean, I know Grace Period is about death and dying and grief, but it's also about figuring out how to move on from that place.
And for readers, it's also funny in places. So there we have your career goal as a child to be a comic.
And teaching requires to be a good teacher, I think requires a certain amount of comedic skill. So I guess the books that I would want to live in are the ones that I'm writing. And I get to spend I'm not a particularly fast writer, so I get to spend a lot of time in those worlds. Because it takes me a long time to come up with the book.
Well, and books, much like, as Alfred Hitchcock said, that film was life with the boring bits cut out.
Right. That sense that I had when I got to film school of, oh my God, this makes so much sense that I'm here because nothing affects me the way a film does. Writing my first novel was that to the nth degree. It was like nothing. This makes more sense than anything because this is where I like to be.
And what was the title of your first novel?
For Keeps.
Keeps.
Published by Naiad Press in 1984, I believe.
Okay,
don't quote me on that.
I want to thank you for being on Bold Voices, Good Yarns. And again, we've been peeling back the pages of Elisabeth Nonas' life. Her current novel is Grace Period, which is published by Rattling Good Yarns Press. It's available through all online and independent booksellers directly from Rattling Good Yarns Press. So, Elisabeth, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Ian.
Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to Bold Voices, Good Yarns, brought to you by Rattling Good Yarns Press. Subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube, and follow us on social media. Search for Rattling Good Yarns Press. Also, Visit our website at rattlinggoodyarns.com, where you can find great reads and interesting articles about the world of books. See you soon!